held editor roles at Wired and Wired.com. She was the editor-in-chief at Deadspin and has launched digital features programs at Esquire and the New York Magazine Week. Stories Megan has edited have been nominated for 2 National Magazine Awards and a GLAAD Media Award, and she was part of the Washington Post team that won the 2008 Pulitzer Prize for breaking news reporting for its coverage of Virginia Tech students. She also has taught journalism at Syracuse University's Newhouse School of Public Communications and serves as chair of the board of trustees of the Columbia Daily Spectator. She also works to support diversifying newsrooms and leads the Princeton Summer Journalism Program for first generation and low impact high school students. I think we have some folks in the room from that program. Welcome. Welcome, Megan. We're so glad you're here. Thank you so much. So let's just get into it. Can you tell us a little bit about what is private equity and why should we care?
Yeah, I think one of the most helpful places to start in defining private equity is distinguishing it from venture capital, because a lot of people confuse them and a lot more people know what venture capital is than private equity. So venture capital basically like invests in startup companies. You make your money when the company makes money, right? You're unicorn hunting. Private equity is very different in a couple of key ways. One, private equity is generally taking over companies wholesale. So rather than taking an ownership stake and maybe a board seat, you're just buying the whole company. Two, is that private equity is generally funded by loans. So they're pooling money from a lot of different kinds of investors. Pension funds, university endowments, Harvard has a lot of money in private equity, sovereign wealth funds, things like that. But that is only a small minority of any given deal. The majority of the deal is bank loans. And the real trick with private equity is the debt for those loans is assigned not to the private equily firm that has made the decision to take them out, but only to the portfolio company. So I can buy your business and say I'm taking out $1 million in loans to do it, and if I drive your business into the ground, I don't have to pay that back. And so the result is private equity firms, often buy companies that are at some degree of risk, but the firm is not shouldering any of that risk itself. Only the company, its workers, the community are taking on the risk.
That's a great way to describe something that's really complicated. I have to talk about private equity a bit in the work that I do, and I have to tell you, sometimes people's eyes glaze over, yes. Right? But that was not the case with your book at all. I honestly think I was like, let me skim this part, and I really couldn't. It was hard to skim because the narrative is so compelling, and you really bring private equity home. You tell real stories about real people and the way that private equity has affected their lives. You had your own experience with private equity when you were at Deadspin, right?
Yeah.
Can you tell us about that a little bit?
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, Deadspin was like a small, kind of snarky, very progressive, mostly sports publication, although we did a bunch of other things as well. And I was the editor-in-chief there, and that was sort of my dream job. Like once I got that job, I was like, great, I've achieved what I want. And I only lasted there about 1.5 years because Deadspin and its sister sites got purchased by a private equity firm. And when we first got bought, I was sort of like, this will be fine. I had some sense that private equity was causing trouble at other companies, but Deadspin was profitable. Deadspin had like a very large and really loyal audience. And when they first bought us, they were saying like, look, we're gonna soup up your business side and then you can do more ambitious journalism. And I was like, great, that sounds perfect. I want us to make more money. And instead what happened was they just started cutting and cutting and cutting to the bone. So I only lasted about 3 months after that private equity takeover, and the rest of what had been my staff followed me out the door 2 months after that. And it really just made me interested in like, why does this system work the way it does? Why can a private equity firm make money by essentially killing off this once thriving publication? And And then once I started paying attention to how private equity acquisitions play out in industries that are frankly more important than snarky sports blogs, right? Hospitals, housing, even local journalism. I just sort of decided that there was a book here that was using storytelling to translate this for real people. Because there are other private equity books out there. There were like 2 published in 2023, one by a Justice Department lawyer working on antitrust stuff, and one by 2 journalists, but they're very like 10,000-foot overviews. I'm a narrative journalist, and I was like, I don't think the only way I'm gonna get the people I want to care about this book to care about this book is by just like telling stories, which is what I like doing anyway, so yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Is this working? So yeah, it feels like private equity, and maybe some of the other books I've read about private equity, it feels kind of like it's out there, it's Wall Street, it's not something that is touching my life, right? And that was really different about your book. There was one story you tell, you have 4 sort of protagonists that you tell their story before, during, and after private equity ownership comes into their lives, right? And one of the people that you talk about is Erin.
Yes.
And she is literally living in private equity, right? It's not just sort of touching her life, it is her home, because she's moved into Southern Towers, and very excited to be able to be in this home where she's feels like she's really taken a step up in life, and is able to provide at a different level for her family, and things go not great from there. Could you tell us about her story a little bit?
Yeah, Loren's such a great character because she will just talk for hours. She's like one of those people you can ask one question, like 3 hours later you haven't gotten another word in, which for a reporter is like a dream, right? And she, you know, like you say, Erin, she was so excited to get into this apartment complex called Southern Towers in Alexandria, Virginia, because she had been in public housing before that. And so getting into like a nice apartment with 3 bedrooms, you know, she has a couple of kids, felt like the dream. And she didn't know that Southern Towers had recently been bought by a private equity firm. And she didn't realize that that private equity firm's strategy was essentially jack up the rents, try to kind of drive over time, drive the lower income tenants out. Southern Towers is 3,200 units, so it's the biggest apartment complex in all of Alexandria, Virginia. And it caters to a lot of African immigrants and refugees because, you know, a couple of families move in there and then it's a place that other people want to gravitate. And so over time, it became like, I think it's like 65% of the community are African immigrants. And, you know, that was not who the private equity firm wanted in there. And Loren is not an African immigrant, although her parents are. And she was very much like, I have the most privilege of basically anybody in this complex, and I'm going to kind of fight back. So her apartment and 13 others were flooded in October of 2023. They got driven out of their homes. And it turned out that it was because of long deferred maintenance on the building that the flood occurred. And the private equity firm that was their landlord was just kind of trying to like take the tenants to the cleaners on this. Like they were like, okay, great, everybody call their rental insurance. Well, of course, like many of those folks did not have renter's insurance. And also like renter's insurance is not supposed to cover when your corporate landlord kind of like screws you over. And so Loren stood up in front of everybody, management, all the other tenants, whoever, and said, no, everybody put your phones away. You're not gonna call your renter's insurance. These people are going to pay for it. And, you know, I won't spoil the ending, but the result was her private equity landlord targeted her personally in like really dramatic and cruel ways that ended with her not having her lease renewed. But they were like making up charges against her that were just patently false. And so it was really striking to see the extent to which this huge corporation based in Los Angeles would be, you know, focusing single-mindedly on this one woman across the country, just because they, they started as a troublemaker.
Yeah, she's pretty incredible. I really encourage you to read the book and read Lauren's story. I think, as though are all of the other characters, I think there's just this passion with them, a drive in them where they are not gonna stop asking the questions, right? They're gonna keep going, they're gonna keep trying to get to the bottom of what's going on. They're like, I don't understand this, I don't know what's happening in my life, I don't even know who owns my company right now, but I'm gonna keep asking because it's not right. One of the things about Loren's story that I think about is, it kind of turns our understanding of property ownership on its head in a little bit of a way. Like, we kind of believe that if you own a property, like this is how a lot of people build a little bit of wealth, is home ownership, right? If you own your home, you take care of it, you maintain it, and after time, it's worth a little bit more than you bought it for. But that is not the profit-making money, the wealth-building model that private equity is using here. They're purposely deferring maintenance, right?
Yeah.
So it seems like as you get into this, you're like, what is this? This isn't how we understand companies work. Or, Can you talk to us a little bit about that bigger idea?
Yeah, I think that's right, and that was the biggest reason I was really interested in writing about private equity in housing specifically, because reasonable people disagree on how much of an impact private equity is having on the nationwide housing crisis. There are a lot of progressives who say essentially like, no, this is just a supply problem. And it is fundamentally a supply problem. That is indisputable, but it is also true that private equity is involved in every sector of the housing market right now. So not just big apartment complexes that are frankly often owned by corporate landlords. So it's like on some level, like how much worse is private equity than any other kind of firm, but also in single family homes. So there was a study in Atlanta that showed that private equity buying up single family homes in Atlanta had driven down the black home ownership rate in that city 4% just by itself, which was like, 4% is only 4%, but like that's pretty striking that a couple of firms can do that by themselves. And so, to more directly speak to your question, I think in a lot of cases, like buying one single family home doesn't actually do that much for private equity firms' bottom line, right? But you start buying up thousands of them. There's a majority black neighborhood in Minneapolis where one private equity firm bought up like 65% of the homes in this one neighborhood, just by itself. And so all of a sudden then you're controlling the lives not just of those families by being their landlord, but also you are by yourself, swinging the market forces into your favor. All of a sudden you now have the power to set rents, etc. And so it's like the kind of domino effect of private equity kind of dipping a toe in and then going a little further in. Now this is a very mixed metaphor, but it really is having pretty powerful effects in a lot of cities. And I've had people say to me like, look, private equity seems like a problem. Thank God it's not my problem, right? Because like maybe you own your home, maybe you work for a nonprofit or some other company that's unlikely to be bought by private equity. But I think if you don't see the ways in which private equity is involved in your life, it's just because you haven't seen them yet, not because they're not there. I mean, they're buying up public utilities now, right? Toll roads, bridges, water companies, nursing homes, dentists, vets, like everything. And so all of a sudden you can set the prices in all of these different fields, and that has a lot of power.
At one point you talk about Milton Friedman, right, who's the sort of father of shareholder value, right? And he says, well, workers and owners have both have power, right? Workers or owners can, employers or owners they have information, they can hire or fire you. Workers, they have information, they can take the job or they can leave the job. But that requires that both sides have equal access to information. And that private equity is, we found, working on trying to understand private equity investments, that it's really hard to find out much information. And in fact, it seems like that's part of the secret sauce, right? That's the proprietary information that they don't want to share. So just asking, how do you make your profit if you're invested in private equity is a hard thing to get into sometimes.
Yeah, even figuring out which companies private equity owns can be really tough. When I started looking into hospitals in particular are owned by so many layers of shell companies that there were hospitals that I could not tell if they were owned by private equity or not. And they do have a lot, they legally have to disclose a lot less than even other kinds of private companies, right? There are all these loopholes where they just don't have to disclose anything. And so the result is all of these workers don't even know in a lot of cases that they're working for a private equity firm in the end, because like, I'll take my character who worked at Toys R Us as an example, 33,000 employees at Toys R Us, many of them minimum wage workers. And you know, if you're a rank and file worker at Toys R Us, your paycheck comes from Toys R Us, your bosses 7 levels above you all work for Toys R Us. Why would you necessarily know that actually who you're ultimately answering to is KKR and Bain Capital, right? And so a lot of, you know, there have been political pushes for more disclosure requirements, but so far there's not been a ton of progress there, a little bit, but.
Yeah, no, tell us a little bit of, you wrote about 4 people in your book. Liz, who works at Toys R Us, Roger, who's a physician in a rural hospital, Natalia, who's a young journalist, and Erin, who we talked about her housing. How did you find these characters? That must have been an amazing process. What was your process for the book?
This was the hardest thing about the book by far. It was just months and months and months of grunt work, like scouring LinkedIn, scouring different Facebook groups, talking to all these nonprofits to figure out like, who do you know? I talked to a little over 300 people for the book as a whole, and almost 150 of them were potential protagonists, because I needed like the right mix of people, right? I needed geographic diversity, I needed racial diversity, I needed gender diversity, all of that, but I also just needed like 4 people who were, like Loren, just gonna talk at me and never decline to answer a single question. And that is not most people, that is not me, I don't recommend that that is ever any of you. But thank God they exist. My darkest night of the soul during the recording process was before Loren, I had another character for the housing section. She lived in Indiana. She'd taken like contemporaneous notes and recordings as everything with her landlord was going down. And I was like, you are the dream character. Thank you so much. And I talked to her for months on the phone, and then I flew out to Indiana, and only once I got to her town did she ghost me. So I'm like, at the moment, right? That was me. I was at like the most depressing like strip mall days in America, just like feeling like, is my entire book falling apart in front of my eyes right now? And all I can figure, you know, I've never heard from her again. All I can figure is that once the rubber kind of met the road, she was in a pretty vulnerable position. She was in and out of homelessness. And I think she was just sort of like, I can't actually give this lady what she needs. And, you know, I had to respect that. And, you know, it all worked out because Loren is a wonderful character, but it was brutal.
Yeah, that's brutal. I mean, I try to imagine the process as I read this, the process that you went through to write it. You also learn about 4 different industries and how private equity operates in each of them, which is slightly different. I mean, it was a lot of work. I admire the work that you put in. And also just like the work of journalists, we need people with these skills to bring these stories to light. We had really a front row seat here in Massachusetts, as we've been around the last couple of years, to see the private equity saga of Steward Healthcare. And a lot of that came to light and got the attention of legislators and regular people because of journalists and because of the reporting that happened at the Boston Globe. That was an amazing story. Did you follow Steward Healthcare?
Yes, so that was all breaking like right as I was finishing up the book. So there's like a little bit about it in the conclusion, but I think there's another version of this book that has a lot about Steward, because that was a dramatic story. And you're right, I mean, the Boston Globe's reporting on that was absolutely heroic. It is stunning to me that they did not win a Pulitzer for that series of reporting. Like they pinpointed exactly how the understaffing that resulted from the private equity takeover of Steward Healthcare had directly caused, I think it was like 17 patient deaths. It was truly like bulletproof reporting. It was really, really impressive. And I think Steward was one of those cases, one of those rare private equity cases that actually does get a lot of mainstream attention, which was good. The last one I can remember that really got that level of attention was probably Toys R Us. And then Joanne Fabric this year has gotten a bunch as well. But yeah, the Steward Healthcare saga was really, truly wild. The scale of like grift there was incredible. Like the CEO had like, it was either 2 or 3 private jets that he would like take on all his family vacations, but they were paid for by the company. He made a $3 million donation to his kids' like extremely fancy private school, elementary school in Dallas, and the donation was out of the company coffers. Congress subpoenaed him and he just declined to show up and got held in criminal contempt. It's just, like the scale of it was truly baffling, but you're right, it also got legislators' attention, and now Massachusetts has probably the second strongest law in the country in terms of increasing scrutiny of private equity deals in healthcare. Oregon has the strongest, and there's no way in which Massachusetts passes that law without the Steward Healthcare disaster, because it affected so many hospitals in this region.
Yeah, and also I think there's characters there too, right? We were lucky enough to hear from some of the nurses at Steward Healthcare who spoke here at the law school and in front of legislators and told some really horrific stories, really, really unbelievable stories about what happened when they didn't have basic medical supplies on hand while their CEO, had 2 jets or whatever it was. It was really, really horrifying, and having private equity touch healthcare is really different. I think it hits at a different level than maybe some of the other stories that we've heard before.
Yeah, totally. And the academic doing all the best research on the effects of private equity in healthcare is a Harvard Medical School guy named Zuri Song. He's brilliant, and he everybody had been theorizing for years that private equity ownership decreases the quality of care, but until he released this big paper with co-authors, but he was the lead author in 2023, that showed that the rate of preventable medical complications increases in a statistically significant way after private equity takeovers. And then he just had one out last week that I haven't even fully read yet about how the quality of care in emergency rooms declines after a private equity takeover. So there's so much happening there right now, and I'm glad that it's getting more attention now.
Thanks. And you mentioned that in Massachusetts we were able to get some legislation. I think it creates more transparency and puts some limits on being able to sell off the property immediately, which is a very common tactic, it seems like, in private equity. Are there what other legislation or other sort of levers of power or change do you see to work around this issue?
So there's very little happening on the federal level. Elizabeth Warren has proposed a bill she calls the Stop Wall Street Looting Act, like over and over and over since 2018. And it would really fundamentally transform the way private equity operates. And it's never come anywhere close to getting out of committee because 88% of members of the House and Senate receive private equity donations. So I think sometimes people think like, oh, like it's all the Republicans like protecting rich corporations. It is everybody. And so I think without a pretty dramatic change in the composition of Congress, you won't see anything major happening there. Closing the the carried interest loophole, which has been a big push. Long story short, carried interest basically like allows you to count your profits not as normal profits, but as like kind of theoretical money, which comes with a dramatically lower tax rate. That's gotten close to being closed a couple of times. Donald Trump has actually said, both in his first term and more recently, that he wants to see that loophole closed. It has failed to happen so far. But there is some interesting stuff happening on the state level. So I mentioned Massachusetts. Oregon just passed a ban on what they call the corporate practice of medicine, which means that financial firms cannot own medical practices, which is pretty stunning. And there's also a lot of like kind of more grassrootsy stuff happening. I didn't want to end this book on a like, well, everything sucks, I'm out kind of note, but nor, like, I'm not an activist, I'm not a scholar, I'm a journalist, and so I didn't really know, I hate the like kind of narrative nonfiction book that ends with like, here's a list of policy prescriptions that in my expert opinion you should do. So instead, all of these four characters had taken some sort of interesting steps to fight back. One of the biggest ones, which is relevant to Erin's work, is that there's a lot of work to lobby pension fund boards to not invest in private equity. And you've seen that pay off in a couple of cases. That really helped the Toys R Us workers get some sort of severance fund because they went to pension fund boards around the country and said, don't invest in KKR until they treat workers of their portfolio companies better. And in 2 states, they actually did temporarily suspend investments in KKR. And like where any given institution is in relation to like what it's doing, investing in private equity is like very up and down at any given moment. Yale made some headlines a few months ago because they dramatically decreased the amount they'll invest in private equity. But last time I looked, Harvard had significantly increased theirs. So it's like, private equity has no shortage of ways to get money, but it is cool that there are some people standing up and saying, okay, but like, only if we get some scrutiny about how you treat people.
Yeah, there's a lot of pressure on investors to make that big return, and private equity comes with a lot of promises that they're going to be able to bring those really high returns. Whether or not they do is up to them, right? And how they do it is also a super important question, but it's hard sometimes for, as we said before, for investors to get that answer. How is it that you're making money? How is it that you're making that huge return? But some of the pension trustees that we've worked with around the country, you know, they're union members, they might be firefighters or teachers, and they sit on the board of their pension funds, trying to protect the retirement money of other teachers and retirement or firefighters, and they've got to make those returns because this is the retirement for working people. But some of them have also asked the hard questions, and sometimes just asking that hard question has led to some change. Like you said, someone went to one of the workers at Toys R Us, I think, went to a pension fund board meeting and was able to ask questions. And the trustees also asked questions. Has any of the management or did any of the private equity staff lose their jobs, lose their income, lose their severance? And it ended up being helping to get a deal for 33,000 Toys R Us workers to get some sort of payout at the end of that. So there is some power in having trustees speak up.
Yeah.
I think that there's hopefully some other options, some other legislation that we can bring in, other levers of power. I don't know if anyone here has questions or ideas about private equity you'd like to add to the conversation. And if you're online, please throw your questions in the chat. Yeah, here, I'm gonna run the microphone.
Okay. Hi, thank you so much for being here. I don't know if this is on. I'll just speak loudly.
It is.
Okay, my question is, it feels to me like this is a fairly new or recent problem. Can you talk about like the rise of private equity, how it suddenly became such a huge thing?
Yeah, no, it's such a good question. It's like new and it isn't. So private equity started in the 60s with what they called bootstrap deals. It was not called private equity then. And essentially they were like buying small family-owned companies that showed the potential for expansion, but maybe didn't have the capital they needed to do it, and trying to build them into public companies. It was like a relatively benign system, but what happened from there was all of a sudden, the eyes start getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and then they start targeting like hostile takeovers. So if any of you have never read the book Barbarians at the Gate, which was about the takeover of RJR Nabisco in the 80s, it's maybe the best, I think it's the best business book ever written. It reads like a thriller. And that was really the moment where everything switched and all of a sudden they wanted these massive companies. But even then it was like a lot of like manufacturing, retail, they weren't really in our healthcare system, our housing system, et cetera. A lot of that has happened in the 2010s for a couple of reasons. One, interest rates were really low and so there was a lot of free money. Two, in healthcare specifically, the Affordable Care Act, unfortunately, because it guaranteed more money to whoever the payer was, that made private equity firms just like flood into healthcare. And three was they had seen which tactics worked in businesses like manufacturing and healthcare. Manufacturing and retail, and it doesn't really matter to private equity firms whether you're working with big box stores or whether you're working with hospitals, right? They're all just widgets. So you can apply the exact same tactics from retail to hospitals, and at that point you might literally be killing people instead of just shutting down big box stores, but like it kind of doesn't matter. So there was this like really steep increase from the 2010s till now, and it's still really ramping up. Like the growth curve has by no means flattened out. Sorry, that was a depressing answer.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Hey, thank you. I was curious, you talked a little bit about like legislation as a potential like help to this, but do you think there's a role for like private lawsuits like antitrust or consumer protection lawsuits that could help, or do you think those might be harmful?
No, I think there's definitely a role for it. So when Lena Khan was running the FTC, she was super interested in regulating private equity and like never quite had the time to like fully do it. But I think I've talked to a bunch of lawyers who are trying to bring lawsuits, and in some cases actually bringing lawsuits against private equity owned companies. Often, I'm not a lawyer, so nobody like hold my poor wording against me, but like often for essentially duping employees, right? And not giving the information they need. And in some cases just for like criminal growth, frankly. So there are a lot of lawsuits against Stewart Healthcare, for example. The like Elizabeth Warren vision of regulating private equity is not going to happen anytime soon. And I think what that means is not, let's all throw our hands up and say nothing's ever gonna happen, but that it's going to take this sort of piecemeal approach. And I do think, yeah, like, I think individual lawsuits against private equity owned companies, like what's going on with Steward, you've seen more of it in healthcare than in anything else, but also like in housing, there have been efforts to like create tenant unions that have like really strong legal power in states where tenant unions, you know, have the ability to succeed and do it that way. So I really do think this is sort of like, for people who are interested in changing this system, it is sort of like an all hands on deck, and lawsuits against individual companies are 100% gonna have to be a part of that.
Hi, thank you for coming. My ears actually perked up when you mentioned the FTC. I just worked at the FTC for a couple of years, and one of the lawsuits that we brought was against a private equity roll-up in Texas against anesthesiology providers. And in that case, there was actually an antitrust nexus in terms of concentrating the Texas anesthesiology market to, I believe, the 60% market share, which pretty much violates most antitrust standards. And I think that case was called US Anesthesiology Partners. There are a couple of other roll-up schemes that I think basically just replaced anesthesiology with another medical practice. Some of that information I think is public as well. So I do think, to I guess answer that question, I do think there's a lot of room there. You had also mentioned the state laws that sort of prohibit ownership of medical practices by corporate schemes. I think they're sort of known as corporate practice medicine statutes. And so I guess my question is, it seems like there is a lot of room at the state level. What kinds of stories and narratives do you think are most compelling to state legislators and state regulators who may be one of the remaining avenues we have in terms of levels of power to kind of pull? And how do we really get that message across? And is it maybe more relevant in certain industry areas? Maybe healthcare is a very compelling area, but just curious for your thoughts on how to help this message sort of get through and really show people the impact and harm that private equity schemes are having across a lot of consumers.
Yeah, it's such a good question. I think you're right that healthcare is like, has thus far shown to be the most tantalizing for legislators, right? Because it like, you know, the Boston Globe was able to trace 17 deaths to private equity ownership, right? So it's hard for legislators of whatever party to like look at your constituents literally dying and not feel on some level compelled to do something about it. The other thing that's really interesting here is there isn't like a clear like red-blue divide on this issue, because anger at income inequality and anger at billionaires, poll after poll shows unite people across the aisle, right? And so you've seen some interesting stuff. So the healthcare section of my book is about rural Wyoming. This is a red county, like even by Wyoming standards, which is really saying something. But they were so livid at the idea that, you know, a gleaming financial firm in Manhattan, of all terrible places, could own their small rural hospital in Wyoming, that they like banded together and were like, we're getting these people out of town. So the problem, I think, or a potential problem, is that not a lot happens without a disaster. So like the Massachusetts law is very strong, and to the credit of Massachusetts lawmakers, they snapped into gear. But that was only after Steward had literally blown up, all of these hospitals had closed, all of these patients had died. So I don't exactly know like what you do to get legislators interested in it before a bunch of their constituents die. But I do think that the hospital and the housing stuff in particular has been pretty powerful. And there was a hearing at the Massachusetts State House that the Harvard Medical School professor I mentioned was part of, and like you could see there was a video where like there was like one video trained on the speaker and another like trained on the legislators who were listening, and you could just watch their faces and see like oh shit, we didn't know any of this, right? So I think there's a lot to be done just in terms of like getting the narratives out there. And that was part of what I wanted to do, was be like, these are actual people, these are not just statistics. But there's a lot more work to be done.
My question is, I think, a similar one to that, but related to kind of on the personal level and interest in private equity. And especially as it relates to people who are working in industries that are taken over by private equity. My guess would be that, you know, if you work as a hospitalist or in practice and you experience the transition from non-private equity owned to private equity owned, you may start to see changes in care and procedure. But a lot of, this has been going on for at least 10 years now. Maybe some newer people entering these industries may not know that these standards used to be different, and there used to be different levels of care. I'm thinking of like, you know, particularly in medicine, but also like if you're a new renter, you may not know it's not normal to be charged all these fees. So I'm curious about how, if you had any experiences of how to educate people, or just share information that this is not how it used to be and this is not how it has to be.
Yeah, it's such a good question. I mean, I think people talking about their own stories is like hard to beat as a tactic, right? So I recently did a panel in DC with Loren, like the actual character. And it was, you know, like I was glad to be asked to talk, but like you could see the difference between how people were reacting when I talk versus how people were reacting when Loren talked, because she can talk in such this visceral way about her own experience. The problem is a lot of people who are most at risk in this system are also the most vulnerable, right? And so they don't necessarily have the incentive to talk, and like I'm certainly not going to insist that they talk when they have real stakes here. But I think, you know, I hope, I don't want to keep writing about private equity forever, but I hope that one result of the work that I and others have done is like getting more people interested in these stories. So many people have emailed me to tell me their own private equity disaster stories, and like, unfortunately, they all kind of start to sound the same after a while. But if you're telling, like, I'm not a local journalist, right? Like I'm trying to tell like kind of the 10,000 foot view of this story. If you're like a local journalist, and I have said to each of these people, like, go to your local newspaper, because if there is story after story in the newspaper in your hometown saying, private equity has caused this disaster, private equity has caused this disaster, all these people are out of their apartments because of private equity, then you start to see like sort of this ripple effect that one person writing a narrative nonfiction book cannot achieve, right? And so I do think it's really important, and I think that it's important that people band together. And I don't mean in like a kind of symbolic kumbaya way. I mean like literally when huge groups of people go against these firms, they have a lot better results. And so there are real opportunities here, and real opportunities for like normal people. So yeah.
Thank you. We're gonna take one more question from our online audience now. This is a question from Maggie. So Maggie asked, Megan alluded to the growing interest in PE and utilities. There was another massive potential deal reported on today. Is there something that's driving that interest, and what might the implications be in that sector? In other words, what does this mean for PE to own the companies that provide electricity, water, heat, etc.? And she referenced the article too.
Okay, cool. I wanna know what that is, because I have not seen today's news. Yeah, it's such a big thing, and it's growing very quickly. I mean, the basic PE model is you sell off as many real estate assets as possible and other assets. You cut services, cut staff, whatever, and you increase costs. right, it's not rocket science. And so if you're doing that in a public utility, then you really have problems. And I think there have been isolated cases of like, you know, water quality standards slip, and so a community may have tainted water, or there are more brownouts than there would be otherwise after private equity has taken over the local electric utility. It's sort of like the hospital thing, where it's like these institutions that we rely on for our basic services are getting taken over, and I just, it does seem like things like brownouts, tainted water, et cetera, are going to increase in frequency as private equity grows in the public utilities space. And that's one of those things where like real people can't have a real impact, because like you can go stand in front of your city council and say, private equity took over here, we had a tainted water problem here, like what are you doing? And local governments have a requirement to listen to their constituents in a more visceral way, I think, than Congress does, for example. So that seems like an area where there is a lot of opportunity for like ordinary people, activists, lawyers, just like neighborhood busybodies to get really involved. Neighborhood busybodies are really my people.
Cool, thank you. I will join me in thanking Megan and Erin. We do have a limited number of copies over here. You can also find Megan's amazing book at the Harvard Bookstore, probably most bookstores at this point. So yeah, go ahead, go out there and buy one as well. And if you want to learn more about our Workers Capital Project, which Erin is director of, you can either come ask Erin some questions, or you can go on our website and find out more about it. Yeah, Erin, you've been.
No, thank you for organizing today, thank you, Megan.
Thank you. I was also just gonna add that like if anybody is running off to class but wants to talk more or anything, my email is like extremely findable online. It's literally just megan.greenwell@gmail.com, and I really like, I sometimes respond slowly, but I actually do respond.